Welcome boys and girls, Costin here with my unit tier list for the vampire counts in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. What's interesting to talk about with regards to the vampire counts is that they have the easiest access of any race in the game to virtually their entire roster of units through the Raise Dead mechanic. In fact, when you're talking about vampire settlements, you don't really focus them so much on recruiting units, though obviously there are things you do want to be able to recruit from settlements, but rather you focus them on being able to improve your economy and getting the various heroes and hero capacity available for the vampire counts. Because Raise Dead is that kind of powerful mechanic, in the sense that you can get even tier 5 units very quickly in a campaign. Especially on higher difficulties if you're fighting a lot of various foes. A lot of powerful foes, fight a very big battle, get a bunch of Raise Dead, get Terrorgeists. Or Blood Knights, depending on what you do have. To be sure, there is a chance in all of this, but typically speaking, the main limitation you'll have in a Vampire Counts campaign will have to do with your economy, not about needing various unit recruitment buildings. So with that in mind, let's start with skeletons. So, skeleton warriors and skeleton spearmen. Well, I would say the warriors are easily an F tier unit. The single worst unit in the entire Vampire Counts roster. Unlike zombies, for instance, zombies can be very cheap, to be sure, and very readily available, so are skeletal warriors, but the combat ability and durability that these guys have in combat is just not that great. I guess one of the things you could say about them is that they're better at resisting range damage, but there's plenty of tools that vampire counts have available to disable the entire enemy range line in a battle. So their shield becomes a bit pointless. And they don't have any real damage capability, their melee stats are just pretty bad. That is my perspective on why I think skeletal warriors are the worst unit to recruit for the vampire counts. Skeletal spearmen, on the flip side, do have a role. They're not the best unit for it, to be certain, neither in the race or in the game as a whole, but their role of anti-large line holders is pretty solid. They are just flat out the better unit compared to skeletal warriors. In almost every single situation that you could imagine, you'll benefit more from recruiting about a bunch of skeletal warriors than with spears or skeletal spearmen than you would from recruiting a bunch of skeletal warriors. That would be my stance on that. Then we have Graveguard, so Graveguard with a regular Graveguard with sword and shield, then two-handed weapons, then the new Halberd unit. With respect to regular Graveguard, I'm just going to put the other ones in C. With respect to regular Graveguard, I think they're a solid A tier unit. Not the best heavy infantry in the game. Far from it, to be certain on that. Not the best in the game, and I might need to zoom out just a bit over there. And I'm actually just going to move a couple of things like that. Not the best unit in the game, from a heavy infantry perspective, but they are a very good line holder against most enemies for much of your campaign, especially when a campaign doesn't matter in that early game. There's also a bunch of benefits you can get for these guys, in particular with Blood Dragons. So you can get Blood Dragon generals, and you can get a significant upkeep benefit for these guys. The one problem you might have is getting enough of them to fill up all of your armies, but these are the one unit you can mass. That and Graveguard with great weapons. So Graveguard with great weapons, they lose that shield, so they're less durable, less suited at holding a line in a battle, but they certainly gain from a damage dealing perspective. And that makes them a very solid unit all around for the vampire counts. Also, it's worth pointing out that when you're playing vampire counts, usually speaking, your generals will be so so ridiculously over the top, that they might be able to handle any real dangerous units on their own. So these guys can deal with the majority of the enemy army pretty effectively. I wouldn't say they're quite S tier. They don't necessarily have the longest term viability of a unit in the game from that perspective. Like, they're a good early game unit, an exceptional early game unit, in fact, but they're kind of like a tier 2.5 unit, kind of. I wouldn't say they're really a tier. Like, when I think of a tier 2 unit, I think of like armor constars. I think these guys are better than armor constars, but I wouldn't say they compare to Chaos Warriors, which are, from my view, a tier 3 unit. But still, a good solid unit overall. Both these versions. Then you have Graveguard with Halberds. So Graveguard with Halberds are an S tier unit. They trade the Grey Weapon for a Halberd, so they're losing some of those melee stats. But what they gain is the ability of holding a line in a way that regular Graveguard just can't. And it's not just a question of being able to hold the line against cavalry, it's holding a line in general. Obviously, they're more vulnerable against range units than usual Graveguard, but they're still a very, very good unit to have in a Vampire Count's army. You might wonder what's the value of a line holder when you have a full-on melee army. Sure, you might have a full-on melee army, but protecting your flanks, holding the line, while other things do the damage, is still a very important thing to have. Moving on, we have the corpse cards of the Vampire Counts. 3 versions. So regular version, unholy lodestone, all that. Okay, so the regular corpse cards, the first 2 variants that are available for the corpse cards, I think they're like kind of C tier unit. They're a support unit that does buff your units in combat. But I think the one unit that is an A tier, maybe even an S tier, depending on what you're dealing with, is the Unholy Lodestone version. I hope I selected the right icon. It can be a bit annoying with these kind of unit variants, right? Especially when the icons themselves in both game and elsewhere is not necessarily the best in the world. But anyway, so Unholy Lodestone, the difference between these and other corpse cards is the fact that these give you regeneration or replenishment for units around them. That is an exceptionally useful ability, especially with all the kind of other healing that Vampire Counts do have in general in their campaign. So keeping an entire army alive or keeping certain parts of that army alive is a very, very useful combat ability for the Vampire Counts in their armies flat out. This is actually the only corpse card unit that I would say is absolutely worth recruiting in most situations or all situations. But then we have Mortis Engines and Black Coaches. So I think Black Coaches, solid enough A tier unit. You should also consider like Corpse Carts and Black Coaches and Mortis Engines like Chariot units. And I think they're pretty decent at that. But keep in mind, they are support units. Mortis Engines, yeah, clearly an S tier unit. Like a pretty solid combat support unit in a battle, gives a bunch of useful benefits that you will use during the course of a battle. There's almost no situation in which having a Mortis engine is a bad idea in a Vampire Count's army. It's got a combat capability, it's got a support capability. Like with Corpse Cards, they're kind of useless in battle, you're bringing them for the buffs. With a Black Coach, there's usefulness in battle to be sure, but Mortis Engine just has that extra edge from my perspective compared to Black Coaches, compared to Corpse Cards with Unholy Lodestone. So they're very useful in combat. You don't want to mass them, to be sure. You want to get like 1 or 2 of them. But even from that context, like, again, there's just very few situations in which you'd say, oh, I don't want to bother with these things, right? I don't need these things. I don't care about these things. That would not really be the case for Mortis Engines from my perspective. Then we have Sylvanian Crossbowmen and Handgunners. Obviously, crossbowmen, handgunners, middle of the road range units, limited capacity for the vampire counts, to be sure. I would even go so far as to put them in C tier, actually. The reason I would put them in C tier, out of all the races in Warhammer 3, the vampire counts have an enormous amount of diplomatic flexibility. You can vassalize a lot of factions and get a bunch of different units through allied recruitment. I would only put them in B, by the way, if it wasn't for that allied recruitment situation, at most. But with that allied recruitment situation, I think if you're looking for range firepower as a vampire counts, there's so many better units available to you. Like, let's say you're playing Vlad. Well, you can get Ungrom as a vassal pretty quickly. You can get a bunch of Imperial factions. Though I don't think, Imperial factions out of vassal units would not necessarily be my choice. In fact, I will go so far as to say they're D tier, when you do consider the kind of vassalization options that you do have. Like, 1, you can get better units from vassals. 2, you can get more units from vassals overall per army than you might have Sylvanian handgunners or crossbowmen. So it's that limited unit capacity. And also the fact that there's much better units far more widely available in any of your campaigns. Then we have Black Knights with Barding, and then Blood Knights. So Black Knights, I would say, are an F tier unit. And they're not a horrible cavalry unit. They're fairly easy to recruit, but they're also kind of the worst cav unit you do have available, or one of the worst fast-moving units you do have available in a Vampire Counts campaign. Especially when you consider, again, the fact that you do have access to all kinds of different units in a Vampire Counts campaign in general. So if you're looking for fast-moving units in a Vampire Counts campaign, I would say that most other things are just flat out better from that perspective. They're just lacking compared to other units. Then we have Black Knights with Barding. So you might say same unit, but a lot better in combat. The one downside I would say with these guys is their cost, upkeep cost, not recruitment cost. Recruitment cost is fairly low in general for Vampire Counts. There's all kinds of benefits you can get for Raised Dead. But the upkeep cost of these guys can be pretty high. There is a way to reduce it, but you're generally better off reducing Graveguard upkeep with Blood Dragons. You do have Red Duke, that is the exception, but the reason I would say they're not an S tier unit is that kind of cost, and also the fact that Blood Knights do exist. Now, normally a very high unit, a very high tier unit like this would not be S tier in my rankings, because I think by the time you can recruit most of these regularly, your campaign is effectively over, and it's just kind of a pointless situation. I think that's something Creative suddenly needs to look at in general with respect to Warhammer 3. But again, Vampire Counts, that unique recruitment situation that does favor them having that kind of greater unit variety overall. And here's the thing. Blood Knights are a really good cav unit in general, but on top of the fact that they're really good in combat, and you might be able to recruit them as frequently as Black Knights with Barding, the one benefit they do have, whereas with Blood Dragons you have to choose between Graveguard and Black Knights, you can always get benefits, the upkeep benefit for Blood Knights. So you actually have a pretty solid economic situation with them. You won't mass these guys, but a single one of these guys is really solid from a combat perspective. Just a great cavalry unit. One of the most widely available cavalry units, actually, in a campaign when the campaign really does matter. Then we have zombies. So from my point of view, I would say zombies are a B tier unit. They're not a horrible unit. They're absolutely worth recruiting en masse compared to skeletal warriors, but obviously they're not an exceptional unit. Of course, there's obviously an S tier zombie faction that is the exception. Most of the time, they're just kind of middle of the road. They're worth it, but you want to replace them with other stuff if you can afford it. But if you can't afford it, well, one of the things to be said about vampires is that a lot of the stuff that they have, you might end up pushing your economy too far by recruiting too many high tier units. You can end up affording it quickly enough, but if you're either limited because you don't have enough Raised Dead, or you're limited because of your economy, then getting a bunch of different elite units coupled with a bunch of zombies, is a really solid strategy. Like zombies and skeletal spearmen. That can be a really solid, core army, if you will, or basic army, supported by a bunch of elite units, your lord, and heroes. And you do have plenty of those available in a campaign. Moving on, we have Crypt Ghouls and Crypt Horrors. Crypt Ghouls, I think, are an F tier unit. The reason behind it is, they're reasonably available, though not the most widely available unit in a Vampire Counts campaign. And they're also not really that great in a combat situation. A lot of these lower tier damage dealing type infantry units just don't work. You could consider these guys an equivalent to kind of like High Elven Rangers, and I'd probably argue in favor of the High Elven Rangers in quite a few ways in a High Elven campaign. But with the Vampire Counts, almost no reason whatsoever to recruit Crypt Ghoul in a campaign. But then you have Crypt Horrors. So I think Crypt Horrors, where would I put them? Well, I would dare say that Crypt Horrors are either a B tier or an A tier to some extent. But I'm gonna put them in B tier. They're a monstrous infantry equivalent to trolls, though they're better than trolls in every way. Obviously, leadership perspective, combat perspective. I mean, yeah, fair enough. I guess they do deserve that A tier rank over there. So they're a good, solid, monstrous infantry that gets things done in a lot of different battles. Fairly durable, fairly good at dealing damage during the course of a battle, and getting things done when you need them to get things done. Next up, we have Mournghouls. Mournghouls are a B tier unit from my point of view. They're not especially the best unit in combat. They're decent enough to be sure, but you have plenty of other options that are better. Like if you're looking in terms of a flanking unit that can move around the battlefield quickly, well, direwolves exist. If you're looking at a unit that can hold the line, plenty of other options exist that will do that better. If you're looking at cav option, again, there's a better situation. For a Vampire Coast, Mournghouls are worth it. For the Vampire Counts, I would say they feel very redundant when you're actually using them in battle, from my point of view. Not the worst unit, can be useful sometimes, but really, the only reason you recruit them is because you have them available and you don't necessarily have anything better to recruit at that particular point. Then we have direwolves. So I think direwolves, where would I put them? Well, one of the problems Vampire Counts obviously have is dealing with artillery and range units. Like there's flying heroes, there's flying units, but the one benefit of direwolves is they're a really, really fast unit that obviously will lose a straight up cavalry fight, but they're so quick, so nimble, and compared to say flesh hounds and certainly rat wolves or wolves in general, I would say direwolves can be fairly durable enough in a fight. They're that kind of unit, like white lions, flesh hounds, wolves, etc., wolf rats. But from quite a few perspectives, they're much better at it. They're just more durable as a unit. You can also get a bunch of different combat benefits, especially with Isabella, so they can be even better. But I wouldn't quite put them in A tier. I do certainly think they're better than Mournghouls, but I don't think that they deserve that A tier spot in many ways. Then we have Fellbats. I'm going to say Fellbats are a C tier unit. Not a horrible unit. A very cheap available unit. There's also all kinds of benefits. And if you're looking for a flying unit that can close the gap, distract a portion of the enemy army, and you don't really care about losing them battle, that's what Fellbats do. They're pretty solid at that. They're just not a really great unit. They're cheap chaff that you can easily replace. That doesn't mean they're a good unit. Then we have Cairn Wraiths and Hex Wraiths. So, where would I put these guys? Well, they both have certainly their uses in battle. So cav option, infantry option, of course. I think they're okay, but I wouldn't say they're exceptional. They can be a bit annoying for an enemy to deal with, but they're kind of like a specialist melee or cav unit in a battle that are useful in only really specific situations. Whereas like Grave Guard, Black Knights with lances and barding, those are generally useful to recruit overall. These guys are more of a specialist unit from my perspective. They're kind of similar to some degree, not quite. Pros and cons. But I'd say overall they're just usually less useful than the other units you do have in a Vampire Counts campaign. You do usually want to recruit them if you have them available, but they're not your highest priority. Then we have Terrorgeist. I think, like, as far as Terrorgeists go, so you have that big undead dragon, right? That can be useful sometimes, but at the same time, like, while it is far more available as a high-tier single entity unit, I do sometimes find them a bit redundant from a battle perspective. They're big, they're slow, they're a big-ass target. I think that is my issue with Terrorgeists, in that, sure, they have a decent amount of combat potential, but when you're dealing with Masters of Range units, you kind of want something to close the gap quickly, or something that can take out a lot of damage and do a lot of damage very, very quickly. That's kind of the difference between Terrorgeists and, you know, Star Dragons or Black Dragons. You look at Black Dragons, you look at Star Dragons, they will take a hell of a lot of punishment, far more so than a Terrorgeist. They won't collapse on the field of battle, and you'll lose them. And they can, yeah, they do feel better in combat. Those other units are better in combat overall, from almost every perspective. And if they are losing, they'll break and run away. Well, usually speaking, right? Or you can kind of get them out easier. You don't have the same risk as you do with the Terrorgeist. Like, I would actually prefer having an unbreakable dragon compared to, like, a Terrorgeist, because Terrorgeist, again, they won't necessarily die the easiest, but if they die, that's it, right? And it can be a bit annoying when it's losing in combat trying to pull it out. Unlike, say, dragons. Because you can just click that retreat button and your unit won't disintegrate while it's trying to retreat. But then we also have to consider Vargheists. So Vargheists are an S-tier unit, because they fulfill that flying role that you want in a Vampire Counts campaign. They're pretty fast, decently durable, will almost always win any kind of fight you throw them against an enemy backlines or range units, artillery units. Hell, they might even win against the melee infantry of the enemy, especially if you support them with a Lord, at least early on in a campaign, against lower tier armies. So, very, very useful unit, not too expensive, more reasonable to recruit these guys than Terrorgeists. Again, Terrorgeists are not a bad unit, but I just think, like, the role that they have in a battle, I think Vargheists just do it better. Then we have Varghulfs. I think Varghulfs, not quite S tier. They're a big single entity. They're not really the biggest. They're also pretty scary, because they're reasonably fast. They obviously won't stand up to something like a Rogue Idol or a Terracotta Sentinel, but they have a lot more battlefield flexibility than those two put together even. So I think Varghulfs in general are worth recruiting. I think they're worth using. I just wouldn't say they're necessarily an exceptional unit, but they do have a decent amount of flexibility on the battlefield. So that is where I stand with regards to the Vampire Counts unit roster in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. Let me know what you guys think about this. Christine, signing out.